They say every town has its secrets. Small towns, quiet roads, houses that look abandoned but hum with unseen life. Somewhere deep in the forests of Appalachia, in a place so isolated that even maps hesitate to mark it, there lived a family the neighbors whispered about in hushed tones. They never went to school, never saw a doctor, and never invited outsiders beyond the rusted gate that separated their world from ours. But it wasn't just their isolation that made them terrifying. It was the whispers of blood that ran through their veins, the idea that what should have been sacred, the bond between parent and child, had been twisted beyond recognition. The story begins with a boy named Illy, or at least that's the name he gave when anyone came close enough to ask. He was born into a house with peeling wallpaper and a creaking floor, a house that smelled of damp wood and something older, darker, that clung to its corners. His mother, Margaret, was the matriarch. To the few who glimpsed her through cracked windows, she seemed almost ethereal, a woman whose beauty had never faded, whose eyes held both a feral intelligence and a haunting emptiness. But behind closed doors, she ruled with an authority that made fear a natural element of the air. Illy was different from other children. His eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to absorb everything around him. He didn't play with the neighborhood kids or chase frogs along the creek. Instead, he followed his mother everywhere, silent, attentive, almost worshipful. The people who dared speak of the family said that Margaret's influence over Illy was total, and that there was a strange intimacy between them that felt unnatural. Children are shaped by their parents, yes, but the bond here went beyond love, beyond care. It was something older, something wrong. In the quiet moments, neighbors swore they could hear whispers, arguments, laughter that shouldn't have existed between a mother and her son. The truth, when it finally surfaced decades later, was horrifying in its simplicity. This family had been trapped in a cycle of isolation so severe it had become a living organism. Margaret had deliberately kept Illy close, closer than any mother should. She controlled every aspect of his life, what he ate, what he wore, what he believed. And slowly, what should have been protection became obsession. It was not just loneliness that bound them together. It was the deliberate cultivation of dependence, of secrecy, and of a moral boundary that had long since been erased. Illy's adolescence was unlike any ordinary coming-of-age story. While other boys learned to navigate the world, to test boundaries with peers, Illy's lessons came from Margaret alone. She taught him to hunt, to forage, to know the forest, as if it were an extension of himself. She taught him language in a way that was precise, almost ritualistic, emphasizing control, obedience, and loyalty. But there was another layer to her education, one that was hidden from the world. In those same whispered hours by candlelight, she began shaping his understanding of desire, of family, of the taboo. It was subtle at first, words chosen to confuse him, to make him question the world beyond their cabin. And gradually, the lessons became more direct, more dangerous. She rewrote morality in a way that only Illy could understand, a morality that centered her as the axis of everything he knew. Neighbors would occasionally notice changes. There were times when Illy would emerge from the forest with scratches, bruises, and an intensity in his gaze that unsettled even the most hardened locals. Sometimes Margaret would come into town with him, always cloaked in a semblance of civility, smiling sweetly and explaining away the oddities as quirks of upbringing. But inside the house, the rules were stark. Margaret's word was law. Illy had no other life, no outside attachments, and the more isolated he became, the more Margaret's influence seeped into every corner of his mind. What makes this story especially haunting is that it didn't erupt suddenly. It wasn't a headline-grabbing crime or a shocking event that finally exposed them. No, the horror here is slow, creeping, embedded in years of deliberate shaping, the inbreeding, The way the family's genetics and morals intertwined was less a biological accident than a psychological one. Isolation, secrecy, and obsession created an environment where the natural instincts of parent and child became corrupted. By the time Illy was a young man, the distinction between mother and lover, protector and predator, had blurred almost beyond recognition. And yet, for all the horror that may leap to mind, there was something undeniably human in their story. They were products of circumstance, yes, but also of choice. Margaret's choices shaped a life, a lineage, that was deeply unhealthy. Her methods were cruel, but in a twisted way they were effective. Illy survived, thrived even within the cage she had built. To the outside world, he was a frightening, awkward figure, someone who didn't quite belong. But to Margaret, he was perfect, an extension of her will, her control, her dark ambition. It is worth noting that the rest of the town had no real understanding of what was happening inside that cabin. They assumed it was strange but harmless eccentricity. After all, families can be odd, parents can be overprotective, but there is a point where protectiveness turns into manipulation, and manipulation becomes abuse, and abuse becomes something more insidious, the erasure of identity. That is what Margaret did to Illy. She didn't just isolate him physically, she rewired him emotionally, psychologically, and morally. The boy who left their house as a man would carry her lessons, her voice, her rules, as though they were part of his own flesh. As the years passed, whispers turned into stories, and stories into folklore. Children would dare each other to approach the edges of the forest, imagining what kind of family could survive in such isolation. But few dared to look too closely. Secrets like this are self-protecting. They twist around themselves, keeping the truth buried under layers of fear, shame, and disbelief. Margaret's family became a ghost story that walked, talked, and breathed. And when the truth finally leaked out, after decades of careful concealment, the reactions were mixed. Horror, fascination, revulsion, and, perhaps most disturbingly, a quiet, reluctant understanding that humans can warp each other's lives in ways almost impossible to imagine. By the time Illy was in his early 20s, the patterns Margaret had instilled were deeply ingrained. The outside world offered him nothing. He had no social skills, no emotional framework for relationships beyond his mother. And Margaret, still beautiful, still commanding, had cemented her role as the arbiter of everything he would ever know. The line between mother and lover, teacher and manipulator, had vanished. What remained was a family unit so entwined, so hermetically sealed, that it no longer resembled anything natural. It resembled a living experiment, a study of obsession, control, and inherited darkness. What is most disturbing about stories like this is not just the actions themselves, but the quiet complicity of silence. No neighbor intervened, no teacher reported the odd boy who never came to school. No law enforcement knocked on a door that no one dared approach. The family's isolation was total, and isolation breeds its own kind of terror. It allows secrets to fester, to grow, to infect every thought and behavior. By the time anyone noticed, the roots of corruption had gone so deep that exposure could no longer undo the damage. And so we begin here with a boy named Illy and his mother Margaret in a house that time almost forgot. They were ordinary in appearance, yet extraordinary in their capacity to twist the most basic human relationships into something unrecognizable. What follows is not an easy story. It is a story of inherited trauma, of obsession, and of the terrifying human capacity to create a life completely detached from morality, from society, from sanity. It is a story that forces us to look into a mirror we might prefer to keep covered and see a reflection we are not prepared to confront. This is a family who lived in plain sight, yet hid in the shadows of human understanding. A family whose darkest secrets were buried in silence, only to surface decades later, leaving the world to grapple with a truth that is both impossible and undeniable. And as we delve deeper, we will uncover the choices, the psychological distortions, and the chain of events that turned what should have been a bond of love into a grotesque echo of itself. Every whisper, every glance, every lesson Margaret imparted was a thread in a web too tangled to escape. They say the past is never dead. In this house, it was alive, crawling through the walls, clinging to the air, shaping the very people who called it home. Illy's story is not just about one boy and his mother. It is a study in how isolation, secrecy, and the corruption of natural bonds can create monsters out of ordinary people. And as we move forward, we will pull back the layers of this family's horrifying history, layer by layer, until we are forced to confront a truth that most would prefer to forget, that evil does not always announce itself with violence or screams. Sometimes it whispers, it lingers, it shapes a life from within. By the time Illy reached his mid-20s, Margaret's control had reached a level that was almost surgical in precision. She had sculpted him not just into a reflection of herself, but into something far more disturbing, a vessel for her desires, her obsessions, and, most insidiously, her sense of legacy. To understand the true horror of this family, one must confront the slow, deliberate erosion of boundaries. It was not a single act that corrupted Illy's life. It was decades of carefully orchestrated dependency, reinforced by isolation, secrecy, and a warped moral universe. The family's home, tucked deep within the forest, was both fortress and laboratory. Every rule, every interaction, was a test of obedience and loyalty. Margaret controlled even the smallest details: what Illy ate, what he read, which words he spoke aloud. Outside influences were purged, forbidden. Friends, neighbors, even extended family were threats to the carefully maintained ecosystem of control. And within this ecosystem, Margaret's intentions were unambiguous. She would never allow Illy to form attachments that might rival hers. The mother-son bond was absolute. It had to be. The psychological toll on Illy was profound, though it took years for anyone outside the cabin to recognize it. He exhibited a remarkable obedience to his mother, an almost preternatural attunement to her moods. Anger, disappointment, or even subtle disapproval could send him into a state of panic. Love, in his world, was inseparable from fear, and fear was inseparable from love. In Margaret's design, this was not abuse, it was training. And it worked. By the time Illy began to notice his own desires, he was already so intertwined with his mother's identity that distinguishing between the two became impossible. It is here that the most disturbing pattern emerges, inbreeding, both biological and psychological. Margaret, in her isolation, had no moral compass to guide her. She saw the world outside as corrupt, dangerous, unworthy of Illy. So she created a microcosm where she could control both his body and his mind. The family's genetic line, already limited by geography and social seclusion, became a closed system. Each generation, each individual, was a repeat of the same patterns: intense dependency, distorted morality, and a redefinition of kinship that ignored conventional ethics. Illy's role within this system was complex. He was simultaneously child, student, companion, and, unknowingly at first, participant in Margaret's experiments. The mother-son dynamic had become a crucible of psychological conditioning, and the consequences were profound. By adulthood, Illy's sense of normalcy was entirely shaped by Margaret's worldview. The outside world, with its social rules, its boundaries, and its expectations, was incomprehensible to him. The moral universe Margaret had constructed was the only one that existed. And yet, despite the intense psychological manipulation, moments of vulnerability leaked through. Ellie sometimes questioned the world outside their cabin, how other families functioned, how strangers interacted. These fleeting moments of curiosity, however, were always smothered by Margaret's vigilance. She had an uncanny ability to sense deviation, to detect even the smallest hint of rebellion or independent thought. And when such moments appeared, she would reassert control, often in ways so subtle that outsiders could never perceive them. A look, a pause in conversation, a carefully chosen word, each became a tool to maintain her absolute authority. As Ellie aged, the cycles of dependency became increasingly toxic. He had no relationships beyond his mother. No emotional framework existed for intimacy with others. Margaret's lessons had created a life where desire, love, and loyalty were inseparable from manipulation. The family's isolation, already extreme, amplified this effect. With no counterbalance, no corrective social influence, Ellie's reality was entirely constructed by Margaret's design. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The family's isolation also created a generational echo, a slow, compounding distortion of biology and psychology. Genetic inbreeding had been unintentional at first. Small, secluded populations often experienced this, but it became deliberate over time. Margaret's control over reproduction was total. She monitored every potential partner, eliminated outside influences, and ensured that any continuation of the bloodline remained within her influence. This created an incestuous lineage, a closed genetic loop reinforced by years of behavioral conditioning. It is difficult to overstate the horror of this arrangement. On the surface, it might appear as simply a case of extreme parental overreach or eccentricity, but the truth is far darker. Margaret's deliberate cultivation of Ellie's dependence, combined with the control of bloodlines, created a situation where natural ethical boundaries were erased. Morality became a construct she dictated. Love, loyalty, desire, even the instinct for self-preservation, each was filtered through her design. The consequences of this psychological and biological entanglement were profound. By the time Ellie reached his 30s, he was fully enmeshed in Margaret's world. His capacity for independent thought, decision-making, or emotional connection outside of the family had been systematically dismantled. To the outside observer, he appeared passive, awkward, even frightening in his intensity. But inside the cabin, he was perfectly molded, obedient, attuned, and, in Margaret's eyes, indispensable. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when Ellie glimpsed a world beyond the forest. On certain walks along the creek, when Margaret's attention wandered, he would see other children playing, families interacting, but these moments were disorienting. The chaos of normal human interaction felt alien, even threatening. The boundaries he had learned were absolute, and stepping beyond them invoked a profound anxiety. Margaret had trained him to fear the outside as much as she had trained him to obey her. The forest, the cabin, the walls, they were safety and prison simultaneously. The family story is not simply one of isolation or abuse. It is a story of systematic erasure, of how a parent's obsession can reshape a life entirely, leaving only echoes of what could have been. Margaret's methods, though extreme, reveal a truth about human psychology, that dependency and control, when cultivated over decades, can produce outcomes almost impossible to escape. Ellie's life became a living study of this principle. He was both victim and participant, shaped by and complicit in the very system that enslaved him. As we delve deeper into the secrets of this family, it is crucial to confront an uncomfortable truth. The real horror is not the acts themselves, but the insidious, invisible processes that lead to them. Margaret's abuse was not a single violent incident. It was a lifetime of carefully orchestrated manipulation, psychological conditioning, and genetic control. Each moment, each lesson, each whispered word in the dead of night was a step in a journey that twisted the natural order of human relationships. And yet, despite the horror, there is a strange, almost hypnotic fascination with their story. It forces us to ask difficult questions about loyalty, love, and morality. How far can a parent's influence extend before it becomes a form of imprisonment? How do isolation and obsession warp not just behavior, but identity itself? And, most terrifying of all, how do generations inherit not just genes but trauma, manipulation, and corrupted moral frameworks? The forest around their home seemed to echo this psychological entanglement. Birds sang differently here, as if muted, and the wind carried a stillness that unsettled anyone who ventured too close. Every sound, every shadow, became a reminder of the family's presence, of the life they had constructed in defiance of nature, society, and ethics. Margaret's influence was a tangible force, permeating not just her son's mind, but the very air they breathed. And as Illy grew older, the lines between mother, mentor, and manipulator blurred entirely. His identity had been subsumed into hers, his desires entwined with hers, his moral compass overwritten. He became, in effect, a reflection of Margaret's will, a living embodiment of her obsession. To an outside observer, the horror is almost too immense to process. To Illy, it was life itself. This is the point where the story shifts from psychological horror to something even darker. What had begun as isolation and obsession evolved into something that challenged every assumption about family, morality, and human nature. The closed circle of their bloodline, the deliberate erosion of boundaries, and the complete domination of one mind over another created a lineage that was, in every sense, unnatural. And yet, it is important to remember that Illy's story is not unique in its existence, only in its extremity. Across the country, in hidden pockets of rural isolation, there are echoes of similar patterns, families trapped in cycles of dependency, secrecy, and abuse. What makes this case extraordinary is the deliberate, conscious cultivation of both psychological control and genetic inheritance. It is a family that, in its darkest moments, became a living archive of human obsession, a testament to what can happen when natural boundaries are erased entirely. By the time the outside world finally became aware of this family, decades of secrecy had already hardened into myth. The cabin in the forest, once merely a house, had become a tomb of a particular kind of human experience, one that defied conventional understanding, one that blurred the line between victim and accomplice, between love and obsession. The horror, when it surfaced, was not sudden. It was slow, cumulative, almost unbearable in its quiet intensity. Illy, now fully grown, carried the weight of his upbringing with a peculiar grace. To anyone meeting him, there was an odd magnetism, an almost hypnotic attention in his gaze, a subtle unease in his movements. But beneath the surface lay decades of psychological engineering. He was the product of a mother who had systematically eradicated every possibility of independent thought, of normal emotional development, of an identity separate from her own. And the most grotesque part of this story is that Illy never realized he had been manipulated, not entirely. Margaret had taught him to see her influence as protection, as guidance, as necessity. What outsiders recognized as grotesque, he recognized as life. The inbreeding that had haunted the family for generations was both biological and symbolic. Margaret's insistence on controlling every aspect of Illy's relationships and reproduction was a means to an end, the perpetuation of the family line under her absolute authority. Every act, every choice, Every denial of outside influence was designed to concentrate control, to insulate her world from interference, to make the family entirely self-contained, and it worked. The bloodline, already narrow, became a closed loop of reinforcement, a perfect storm of genetics, psychology, and obsession. What outsiders eventually learned, piecing together fragments from neighbors, law enforcement reports, and interviews with those who had dared to approach the edge of the forest, was almost unimaginable. The family had survived and in some ways thrived in an ecosystem of secrecy that most could not comprehend. Children born in this cycle carried the genetic weight of repeated inbreeding, the emotional weight of manipulated attachments, and the social weight of having no context beyond the cabin. Each generation became a mirror of the last, a reflection distorted by Margaret's influence, yet strangely coherent within the rules she had established. It is tempting, when confronting stories like this, to seek the dramatic moment of revelation, the violent outburst, the confrontation, the crime that shocks the world. But the true terror of this family lies elsewhere. It is in the quiet, almost invisible accumulation of control, in the normalization of what should be unthinkable, in the way love itself was transformed into a tool of containment. Every whispered lesson, every moment of guidance, every act of forced dependence contributed to a slow, inexorable erosion of autonomy. By the time the world became aware, the damage was total, irreversible in ways that were both physical and psychological. Ellie's existence, shaped by Margaret's relentless oversight, raises questions that are difficult to answer without discomfort. What is the nature of free will when every choice has been guided, every desire preconditioned, every moral judgment overwritten? How does one measure innocence when the capacity to understand morality has been deliberately stunted? And perhaps most haunting of all, how does a person untangle themselves from a life that has been constructed so completely by another, without losing their sense of self entirely? Some observers described Margaret as monstrous. Others saw her as brilliant in her manipulations, terrifyingly cunning, a strategist of human behavior who understood instincts and boundaries in ways most people never could. But the word monster feels insufficient. Margaret's acts were monstrous, yes, but the deeper horror lies in the intimacy of her influence, the slow psychological colonization of her son's mind. She was both parent and warden, guardian and manipulator, source of life and source of entrapment. And Ellie, the boy who had been molded under her direction, had become both product and participant, willing and unwitting, enmeshed in a system from which there was no clear escape. What makes this family's story particularly haunting is the legacy it leaves. Decades of isolation, control, and inbreeding created more than just genetic anomalies. It created a pattern, a template, a cautionary example of what can happen when human attachment is weaponized. Ellie's life was a testament to the way trauma can be inherited, not just through experience, but through the deliberate shaping of relationships and the containment of choice. It is the kind of horror that lingers quietly, not in screams or headlines, but in the subtle, unspoken ways that human beings can distort one another's lives. The forest around their home seemed to absorb this darkness, holding it in the shadows like a memory too painful to forget. The neighbors would speak of strange figures glimpsed through trees, of laughter that did not belong to children, of movements and sounds that suggested life, but life twisted into a shape that defied comprehension. It is here that the story becomes almost mythic, yet tragically real. The combination of isolation, control, and obsession created a space where normal human morality ceased to exist, replaced by the internal logic Margaret imposed, a logic that dictated loyalty above all, even above decency, even above love as we understand it. When outsiders finally confronted the family, the reactions were predictable but inadequate. Shock, revulsion, disbelief. How could this have gone unnoticed for so long? How could a mother shape a son so completely, to the point where the boundary between right and wrong was not just blurred, but erased? Yet the most chilling realization was that Illy had internalized this system so thoroughly that even when exposed to the outside world, he could not fully comprehend it. Margaret's lessons were permanent, etched into the very core of his identity. Freedom, in its ordinary sense, was no longer a concept he could access, and so the story ends in a way that is both haunting and unresolved. Margaret's influence, the inbreeding, the cycles of obsession, these did not conclude with a dramatic event. They continued quietly through years of secrecy and silence. Illy existed as a living archive of her design, a reminder of how one person's obsession can shape a life, a lineage, even a small corner of the world in ways that are almost impossible to undo. The moral of this story is not simple nor comforting. It is a meditation on human nature, on the fragility of autonomy, and on the terrifying potential for love, when twisted, to become a mechanism of entrapment. What can we take away from this? Perhaps it is a reminder that the most insidious horrors are not always external. Sometimes they are cultivated within homes, within families, within the very bonds that are meant to protect us. The story of Margaret and Illy is a cautionary tale, not just of genetics or isolation, but of obsession, control, and the capacity of one human being to remake another entirely in their own image. And in that remaking, all moral boundaries, all ethical lines, all ordinary measures of right and wrong can vanish. The cabin in the forest still stands, though the residents have changed, moved on, or vanished. The echoes of what occurred there remain, however, embedded in the land, in the stories, in the collective memory of those who dared to whisper its name. And Illy, whether he remains in that shadowed world or has ventured out, carries with him the legacy of a mother's obsession, a life remade by fear, desire, and control. He is both victim and monument, both caution and enigma, a living testament to the disturbing truths hidden beneath the surface of ordinary towns and ordinary lives. In the end, the story of this family is not just about horror. It is about human capacity, capacity for control, for manipulation, for redefining the bonds that should protect us, and for creating systems of oppression so intimate they are nearly invisible. It is about the fragility of identity, the inheritance of trauma, and the slow, deliberate corruption of what should have been the most sacred of connections. We look back on this story not merely to be horrified, but to remember that sometimes the darkness we fear most is not in the world outside, but in the places we trust the most, in the people we love the most, and in the silence that allows secrets to grow. Margaret and Illy's story is a warning, a testament, and a quiet, relentless horror that will not be easily forgotten. Because when love becomes a tool of control, when bloodlines are manipulated, and when the line between parent and child is erased, the consequences are not temporary. They echo through decades, through generations, through every whispered secret that refuses to die. And somewhere, deep in the forest, the house still stands, a reminder that the most inbred family is not only a story of genetics, but of the human heart twisted by obsession, secrecy, and fear.